Hello, and welcome back to Staying in My Lane podcast. Today, we are diving into a topic that I feel like a lot of us can relate to. And we don't like necessarily talking about it aloud, but it comes with good reason because it may cause some unspoken or unintended tension in families. This actually came in a listener question in an email, and I really didn't know what to do with it because I wanted to talk about it, but I didn't know how. But the question underneath of it was simple. What happens when your parenting values clash with your in laws or your parents or your family in general, and no one agrees on how to move forward? And today we're going to dive into that unspoken tension with families and generational differences in parenting, conflicts around discipline, like yelling or physical punishment. I feel like that was much more common when we were kids. But, just thinking about the impact that that has on development with children and knowing and having the research now, I want us to think about what it really means to raise children in alignment with your values when others don't agree or when they undermine your parenting. This is not a black and white conversation. It's layered and it can be deeply personal to some of the listeners that are, listening into this episode. So if you can relate to this, stick around. So before we get started, I just want you to think about your own life and kind of reflect on what parenting values or what parenting styles you have, and if they're different from your parents or your spouse's parents or your family members' parents, whatever it may be. And think about the changes in those parenting styles, them versus yours, and just think about why. One of the things that I have done in the past couple years is really dive into the reasoning behind what I'm doing, the reasoning behind how I'm, presenting myself, or how I'm choosing things, how I'm making decisions, what I'm choosing in my life. And the reason I do that is because I want to be intentional about what I do. And having gone through a lot of trauma with my ex-husband and the parenting that we had together, which it was not co-parenting. I have to say it was more counter-parenting. He would counter everything I do out of spite. And that's, he was abusive. That's a whole different conversation. But I decided when my ex-husband's rights were terminated that I would show up for my children in the best way that I could, and that I would do the research and I would read in depth and purposefully, intentionally, the articles behind it. And I would search and search before I made concrete decisions because I want to make sure I'm covering all my bases. And that goes for, physical health, emotional health, mental health, school, education, wellness, overall health. And I wanted to make sure I was making the right decisions. So being very intentional about what I choose. A lot of that changed. When I was younger, I thought I would parent exactly how I was parented. And then I started going to therapy and I started seeing all of these different things. Not saying anything my parents did were wrong, but I see now where things have to be different because we live in a different time in our society. Same with my in laws. And, I definitely am a very observant person. I've always had a gift for observing patterns of behavior, which has made me be very intentional about not doing that or psychoanalyzing because I latch on to energies around me and that can affect my mood very quickly. And I don't want to psychoanalyze the people in my life. I don't think it's my job. I'm just more curious on the reasoning behind why people do things. So I always find it interesting when I'm observing patterns. And I try really hard to not step on toes or offend people who may think differently than me, which is why I think I'm intentional about how I observe people and their patterns. The only thing is, I think that we as parents need to do what's best for our world in 2026 versus, 1996 or 2006, whatever. So, I think that the world has changed a lot. There's a lot more research and education out there. And we can't parent the same way that our parents did. Not because what they did was wrong or that they weren't enough, but because our world has changed and we need to be more intentional about what we're exposing our children to. So, if you've ever felt judged, misunderstood, or torn between keeping the peace and standing your ground, this episode is for you. And really sit with that feeling for a moment and just think about your own parenting journey. Because that feeling, that tension that you can't always name, it's not loud and it's not always explosive. Sometimes it looks like a comment that lingers longer than it should, a look across the room when your child is crying, someone stepping in when you didn't ask them to. And what makes it so difficult is that nothing technically happened, but everything shifted, right? You don't just marry a person, you marry a system. And I'm going somewhere with this, so stick with me. When you marry that person and you choose to have children with them, that's something that you need to be on the same page with, you and your spouse, or you and your partner, because it's very easy for families to influence or kind of join in or insert themselves into conversations or situations that are maybe not the most appropriate. And when you marry somebody, you marry into a family system, that system that was created before you entered the picture. Things like generational patterns, generational behaviors, things like generational values and parenting beliefs. So it's kind of nerve-wracking, if you will, to come in and choose differently. That system was existent before you even came into the picture, because it's not just love. You don't marry into somebody's family and just feel love. You feel their values, their beliefs, their communication styles, parenting philosophies that were formed decades before you even entered into the family. And that system comes with a set of rules, the unspoken ones, the inherited ones, the protected ones. And it starts with a look or a comment like, well, we used to do it like this back in my day, or when I was doing this, I did this. And over time, these moments can kind of begin to accumulate some tension. Once children enter the picture, the stakes change, because now it's not just opinions, it's parenting. And parenting becomes deeply personal when you become a parent, because now it's not just about preference, it's about protection and actually parenting. Research and developmental psychology show that parenting choices are often shaped by our own childhood experiences and also by our desire to either change them, replicate them, or repair them. So when someone challenges how you're raising your child, it doesn't feel like feedback. It can feel like a threat to your identity or your competence as a parent, to your sense of safety as a parent as well. And that's where the nervous system jumps in, because your reaction, it's not just about the moment. It's about what you went through, what you experienced, what you're trying to prevent from happening, what you're determined to not repeat, or what you're trying to repair within yourself. And that's why in these moments, they can feel so intense. Your nervous system is not just reacting to the comment, it's reacting to what the comment represents within yourself. Parenting has shifted greatly over time. We just talked about that briefly. And that creates friction. Practices that were once considered normal, like physical discipline, yelling as a form of control, children being seen rather than heard, or the bedroom children children who spend the majority of time in their bedrooms and don't come out to the living room, because the belief before was that children should be in their bedrooms, so when dad gets home from working or mom gets home from working, they're in charge of the TV. And I feel like a lot of the generations would sit in front of the TV and watch TV while they're eating their dinner, and that was their form of bonding. But the children, and I've talked to a lot of people about this, so I don't feel like I'm just pulling it out of my ass, but a lot of children were sent to their rooms or told, go to your room, go find something to do. And there wasn't a lot of hands-on conversations, or it was more that fear-based parenting. Not because they didn't care, and I'm not saying that generations before us did not care or they were trying to do anything wrong. I don't think that that's the case at all. I just think that now we have access to much more research, more language, and more awareness around parenting. So it's easier for us to pick up a book or pick up, an article in a paper or whatever, look it up on Google and see the statistics behind it and the education and research behind what these things and how our parenting affects brain development in children and how that brain development is impacted long term, because those patterns and those parenting styles follow us into adulthood. And that's not something that we were, taught before because we didn't have access to that. So we're not parenting in the same world anymore. We're parenting with more information, more emotional awareness, and more accountability. For example, studies in child development show that chronic exposure to yelling or harsh discipline over time can increase stress responses in children. Therefore, they carry it into adulthood, which impacts their emotional regulation and, their behavior throughout that period of time. And there is research that shows that fear-based discipline may provide or produce short-term compliance, but it does not support long-term emotional development or internal self-regulation. So, you look at people who were parented with that fear-based parenting, they often have a lot of dysregulation with their emotions. I feel like that's why a lot of us millennials have emotional regulation and internal conflict issues. And the majority of us, I feel like, do. I don't know if everyone admits it aloud, but that right there is the bridge between generations. Not saying it's wrong, not saying we're judging it, but now we have that compassion, or we should have that compassion to understand. But I also feel like at the same time, it's important to acknowledge something else. Most parents, past and present, are not intending to harm their children on purpose. We do the best we can with our tools and our toolbox. But now we have compassion and conflict in the same space with the older generation versus a younger generation. And that's where the tension lives, because now we have two perspectives existing in the same space. One that says, okay, this is how we were raised and we turned out okay. And another one says, I want to be more intentional about what I pass on. And I've said the word intentional a couple times now. I don't believe in gentle parenting. I don't like that word. I think that term is kind of toxic and dangerous to use. I think the more appropriate term is intentional parenting, because I think that's much more healthy. I think that represents and speaks volumes for what it actually represents about being intentional in making the choices and making the informed decisions for our children and how we parent. Intentional means that you're thinking long term, not reacting short term. Neither perspective, is necessarily wrong or sees itself as wrong. And that's what makes the whole dynamic between, this is how I parented versus this is how I'm going to parent. That's what makes it so complicated. I want to move on to intent versus impact. This is more so about boundaries and breaking these patterns and how it relates to our identity. When we look at intent versus impact, the truth that we can talk about and that we can really anchor us into this conversation is that intent and impact are not the same thing. Meaning that someone can have good intentions in a conversation or a situation or a gesture and still create an impact that feels harmful or misaligned with values. And this is where most conversations will take a turn and even fall apart, because people defend their intent while you're responding to their impact. Okay, I'm going to say that just one more time because I feel like that's important. People defend their intent while you're responding to their impact. This is especially relevant in conversations around parenting and discipline when we're talking about this, because what one person views as structure or authority, another person may view as fear or disconnection. And that's that break, and that's that rift in generations. Research shows that in the attachment theory we've talked about, that it highlights how children thrive when they experience consistent emotional safety, responsiveness, and connection. That doesn't mean parenting is permissive or soft. It means that it's intentional, which is why I really like the words intentional parenting. I don't know if anybody else uses that, but it's something that I think is really, you know, positive. This means that discipline is not just about stopping behavior, it's about teaching skills, emotional regulation, problem solving, and self awareness long term, not just stopping the annoyance or overstimulation in the moment. We're not shoving everything into a corner and telling the kids to forget about it and move on. We're teaching them how to work through it, because what happens when we suppress all of our emotions? Eventually, it's going to come out later. And it's kind of like that volcano. It's going to erupt and it's going to overflow. We are raising adults, not trying to control children. And again, I think that's another difference in the parenting is parenting prior was about control. Parenting now is more about intention. So rather than asking, does this control behavior? Many parents today are asking, what does this teach in the long run or long term for my child? The real conflict is, that control versus respect. As we kind of segue into this conversation, what's interesting about these things is that these are conflicts that are not just about discipline. And I think this because I feel at the core, these issues are about something deeper. That control, authority, and respect is a really big thing. And I'm not saying it's not, but everyone defines those words differently and has a different meaning for those words. So when an in law, a parent, or a grandparent questions your parenting, it can feel like they don't trust you, or they don't think that you're doing a good enough job, or that they don't respect your role as the parent. On the other side, they may just feel like everything that they did or that they, happened in their time is being disrespected or rejected. So what do you have now? Now you have both sides feeling disrespected for completely different reasons. And I feel like this is where the breakdown in communication comes into play. The way that I was raised by my parents and the way that I raised my children is being criticized or judged. So now that conversation isn't just about the child anymore. It becomes about identity, legacy, and sometimes even ego. See my point? That's why it escalates so quickly and turns into who's right and who's wrong. And it can feel very offensive and put you on the defense when you're feeling this way. That's where boundaries come into play. We've talked a lot about boundaries on my podcast, and I say every time, boundaries are not walls, they're not punishments if they're for the right reasons. Boundaries are clarity, not rejection. It's a clear path to what you feel you need. And when we talk about boundaries with this in correlation to this conversation, you can simply say, I have a boundary. And that boundary holds both respect and separation at the same time. Boundaries are not about being controlling or controlling someone else's behavior. They're about defining what you will and will not allow around your family or your child. And with that, I also feel the need to say, I feel it's appropriate to create boundaries that you and your spouse or you and your partner both are in agreement on for your child. Because again, there are times where I've seen women who think that they make all the decisions for their children. And I do think that it's important to involve both parents. Whatever that looks like in your family, I feel like that's healthy to involve both parents because it sets an example that you guys are both on the same page. A lot of people don't understand why boundaries are created in the first place, because especially when there hasn't been boundaries in the past, or when boundaries in the conversation around boundaries was not such a big thing before, it could almost feel like a threat or a punishment to that person. However, in reality, boundaries are what allow relationships to function with mutual respect rather than silent resentment. Without boundaries, resentment grows quietly. And one of the hardest truths to accept in that is that you're not responsible for how someone reacts to your boundary. However, you are responsible for holding it consistently because otherwise, what good does it do? Navigating this whole situation without escalation is very difficult. So you have to be very intentional about what you will and will not allow. And I'm not saying to be controlling, I'm saying to be intentional because that's where I feel like the lines get blurred. And, I feel like what makes parenting conflict with family feel so intense is that it's not usually just about the child in front of you, it's about the moment that awakens inside of you. A comment about your child can hit an old wound in seconds, whether you know it or not, like whether you're aware of it or not. But that's mostly like the underlying issue, I think. Suddenly, you're not just a parent being questioned, you're a daughter, a son, a spouse, a child, or maybe even a younger version of yourself who remembers what it felt like to be dismissed, overpowered, or not even fully seen. And that's why these moments can feel so much bigger than they actually are, because psychologically, your brain is not only processing the present disagreement, it's scanning for that past pattern or old power dynamic and looking for that emotional danger. So when it looks like a small disagreement, but it can feel bigger than what it actually is, that's probably activating shame, defensiveness, self doubt, and even grief. And that's where a lot of people listening, I feel like, will know exactly what this feels like or can relate to something similar. Someone says one sentence about your parenting, and suddenly your chest gets tight, your stomach drops, you replay the conversation in your mind for hours. Maybe you're overthinking it. Maybe you need to over explain. Maybe you go quiet or you feel angry. Maybe you even go off on the person who told you that, I don't know. But my point is that underneath that anger is a deeper feeling of not being trusted. This is not you being dramatic. This is your nervous system responding to a perceived threat. Now, if you take it too far and you go off on somebody and they get into a physical argument or whatever, that may be taking it too far. But sometimes the threat is emotional. It's the threat of being judged, the threat of being undermined, the threat of being made to feel small in a role that matters very deeply to you. And, with mothers, I think about, motherhood becomes our identity. So when someone attacks or judges or even makes a comment about our parenting, we take that extremely personal. I feel like that's a big part of why we over explain. A lot of us over explain our parenting choices because we're not just trying to be understood, we're trying to prevent conflict, avoid rejection, and prove that we are not failing. Especially in a society that feels like you always have to compete with one another, or, you have to have the Pinterest perfect cupcakes for school, or, having the TikTok trends of the mom and kid, or whatever it is. We compare, and we are a society that competes. And it's always about who does better, who does this, who does the healthiest. When in reality, we should stop judging parents and other moms and just focus on ourselves and live our own lives, raising our own children. And I think we would be a lot more successful if we just did that. But, over explaining often comes from anxiety. It comes from that internal belief that if I can just explain myself well enough, calmly enough, in a lot of detail, that maybe I will kind of save myself and maybe not everyone will have something to say about it or criticize me. Maybe I can avoid being misunderstood or judged. However, the truth with that is that not everyone is asking questions because they truly want understanding. Some people are asking from a place of control, discomfort, or disagreement. That's why, and I've learned this with myself, over explaining can leave you feeling exhausted and more stressed out than before because you keep trying to create clarity with someone who may not actually be open to hearing it. And, whether that's a family member, a friend, coworker, whoever it is, I personally have had experience where I've tried to over explain myself in certain situations, and it has just mostly made more conflict because I didn't get the result that I was expecting. So, for example, I over explained a parenting choice in my parenting style of intentional parenting to someone in my family. And I got a lot of pushback on that. The reason being that this person did not agree with the way that I was raising my child. And this person had done something to undermine me and to go against my wishes. So I over explained with the kind of text messages that just seemed like word vomit. It just was like I had to prove to her that I was doing something right. However, I realized that it didn't matter what I said. She was going to have an opinion. She was dead set on the fact that she already knew I was in the wrong. So the over explaining did no good. And that's why I'm giving the advice right now, too, that it does no good to do that. I've been in that position. It only causes more damage and more hurt within yourself if you do that. And one thing I'm learning with myself is that less is more. Saying okay and just leaving it at that. It's a simple word, it's a simple response where no one can come back on you and try to argue with you. I mean, maybe they can, but saying okay and just leaving that where it lands, it's not going to open the door for any more conflict. And maybe some people want conflict, maybe some people feel the need to prove their point, but I'm becoming personally in a place where I don't want to prove my points anymore. I just want to be in peace. And I think when we are thinking about our children, of course, we are intentional and we're deeply invested in protecting them and being able to do the best we can. But we have to remember that we're doing it for ourselves, not for the generations before us, not for our parents, not for our great grandparents, not for their school teachers. We're raising them in the way that we want to, in the way that we know how to, and we're learning with them. I think one of the hardest parts of parenting and having this kind of conflict is the guilt that comes with it. You know, you want to do the best you can, and you don't, we're never going to know until they're an adult. And again, they make their own choices when they're older. One thing that I think is not looked at enough is that children's brains are not developed until around 25 years old, I think, fully or something like that. Not making an excuse, but simply saying that we have to remember that when we're thinking about parenting. Our children will need us past the age of 18. And a lot of the previous generations were ready to be done with the parenting when their kids were 18, because that's when you're an adult. Therefore, I think one thing we have to remember and be intentional about is that and I'm saying in present day, not saying generations before or anything like that, but like right now in the moment, is we have to remember that we are raising our future generations, and we have the research now to show the impacts of, the yelling and the hitting and the spanking and all of these things, the threats, the empty threats, I think is a big one. That's not going to raise regulated, respectful adults. That's going to raise dysregulated, angry, resenting adults. And it's not necessarily about the control factor, right? We can't control children. We cannot make somebody do something. I don't care how old you are. If you're trying to force a child to do something or make a child do something, I think that's not a good thing. We can't, and I'm not saying with like the respect, I think children should be taught to respect. I think children should be taught to not interrupt. And you can do those things, like tell them those things or parent in ways that you're teaching them to not do something without the shame, without the criticism, without the embarrassment or the anger. And a lot of that shaming and anger was something that I feel like a lot of our millennial generation experienced. And so it kind of leads me to the fact that a lot of our parents may think that we are disrespecting them by, or betraying them by changing the way that we're parenting. And then we may feel guilty. But guilt is not always a sign that we're doing something wrong. Sometimes it's a sign that we are doing something differently. Sometimes guilt is what shows up when we stop participating in patterns that used to keep everyone comfortable. We're choosing differently. We're choosing something that is healthier. This can show up in ordinary moments, like when your child is crying and someone says, "They're fine, just let them cry." Actually, they're not fine. Or when you're trying to talk to them calmly, meaning your child, and someone interjects with, "Kids get away with anything nowadays." Or when your child is overwhelmed and a family member feels the need to make a comment or have a facial expression that embarrasses them or makes them feel shame. If another adult responds with harshness or, anger, then it becomes that you're not just managing your child's emotions, you're managing your own reactions to the situation. Or when someone laughs at your boundary like it's too extreme or too excessive. When they correct your child right in front of you in a tone that you would never use. When you leave a family gathering and spend the whole drive home feeling heavy, tense, and wondering if you're overreacting. That one I've definitely felt. These are moments that build up. Those are the moments that people remember, not because they're always explosive, but because they create a steady emotional friction that wears you down. And I honestly feel like most of the moments that I replay in my mind or that I feel the most tension with are not the loud, explosive moments. They're the subtle looks that I get from people, including family members, parents, in laws, when one of my children is acting out or when they say something and I can see the look in their face, like they're mortified or they're, irritated. And there is a sense of guilt and shame associated with that. And again, I have to remind myself that they are not me. I am not them. And I'm doing what's best for my children in this moment, in this present day. And that's all that matters. I feel like a lot of parenting conflict with family is really old family dynamics resurfacing in a new form. Maybe growing up, you were the peacekeeper, so now you feel responsible for keeping everyone comfortable, even when it costs you your own peace. Maybe you were the one that got dismissed, so now being questioned feels especially painful. Maybe love in your family felt tied to compliance, so setting boundaries makes you feel like that connection is at risk. That's where the psychology part matters. Because once you understand your patterns, you stop seeing yourself as too sensitive or too reactive, and you start realizing that your present response has roots. And when you understand the roots, you can choose differently. And when we talked about the fear and respect, the difference between that, you know, they can look similar on the outside short term because both can produce compliance, but psychologically, they are not the same. Respect grows from safety, trust, and consistency. Fear grows from unpredictability, power, and emotional threat. One of them builds internal regulation, and the other one builds hypervigilance. One teaches a child how to understand themselves, and the other one teaches a child how to avoid consequences. This is such an important distinction because sometimes the older generations saw obedience and assumed that it meant parenting worked. But what they could not always see was that what was happening internally beneath the surface was so much more than just complying with what was happening in the moment. And another thing to understand psychologically with that is that people get so defensive when their identity feels threatened. So when older generations hear that we're doing this differently, they may not hear that it's a parenting preference. They may hear you did it wrong, and this does not mean you are responsible for managing their emotions with that reaction. But it does help explain why these conversations can become so emotionally charged so quickly. The defensiveness that they have may be less about the current moment and more about what your choices bring up for them. Things such as regret, shame, confusion, and even powerlessness. Again, this goes back to understanding that this does not mean excusing bad behavior. It just helps you stop personalizing every reaction. And, I look at certain situations where I've had older generations tell me that they will not tolerate disrespect. And again, every person has a different meaning to what respect is. And I think the one thing that the older generations don't do is taken into consideration and account with that children don't know how to respect right away. It's learned. And that's another thing too, is that the older generations modeled emotional dysregulation, flying off the handle and reacting to every situation. That's what we learned to model. I'm not saying that it's wrong. This is not a blame game. This is simply acknowledging and observing patterns that have happened and things that we are breaking to be better parents for our children, showing up more in the present moment for our children. One of the things that I so often think about is that when I see someone from an older generation responding to a child now in present day, they get so offended sometimes, and even our generation, people in general get so offended at a child being disrespectful. And granted, there are situations where a child should know better. But my first question isn't, well, or I guess not question, but my first thing is not to go to, well, they're a little asshole or whatever it is. My first thought is, what are they being shown at home? Because children will model what they see. You can tell a child all day, every day to do XYZ and ABC are wrong. Don't do that. But if you're doing that, ABC, 1, 2, 3, they're going to model that behavior. It doesn't matter how many times you tell them not to do it. If they're seeing an adult doing it, they're going to do it because their brains are not wired the same way we are. So when I see an older person, most of the time this has happened with an older person, telling me or telling, saying in general, I've seen it at stores and things like that too, that they feel disrespected or they're not going to tolerate disrespect. My first thought is, do you understand how a child's brain works? It's not an excuse, that's a fact. That's psychology, that's biology, that's scientific research right there. A child's brain is not going to register and interpret disrespect or respect in the same way that you are going to as a grown, developed adult. So, and again, we all have different definitions of that, anyways, but we have to remember, and I think a lot of adults have to remember, that they are the model for the child. So if they're reacting and they're getting all huffy and puffy, or they're doing something or saying something and they don't want the child to do it, then they shouldn't be doing it themselves. Obviously, not everybody's going to agree with me, and there's certain situations in where I feel like that's not going to be applicable. But my point is that from a brain development standpoint, this matters more than people realize. A child's brain is still developing, especially in that prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for impulse control, decision making, and emotional regulation. And those three things are probably the most important and most prominent things with a child. So, that part of the brain that we're talking about is not fully developed until early adulthood. So, when a child who is overwhelmed, acting out, dysregulated, they're not choosing to behave that way necessarily because it's not going to be the same way that an adult would choose to react that way. They're operating, meaning the children are operating from a more reactive part of the brain, like the amygdala, which is responsible for stress and survival responses. And a lot of child's responses are survival reactions and reactions for stress. This means that when discipline is rooted in fear or harshness, it can actually activate the stress response even more, rather than teaching the child how to calm down or regulate. On the other hand, when a child is met with consistency, calmness, and emotional safety and guidance, it helps strengthen those higher level brain functions over time. So, in a real sense, I guess, the way that we respond to our children is not just shaping their behavior in the moment, it's shaping how their brains learn to handle stress, relationships, and emotions long term. And again, this goes back to not reacting in the moment, pausing and thinking about things before you react. Because again, if you're a parent or a grandparent or an aunt or uncle, you have littles watching your every move, and they're soaking up everything that you react to, every word that you say, every behavior that you have. And so they're going to model that. And the only person that people have to be mad at when a child does something that you don't want them to do, for example, if you're over there, saying shit, fuck, damn, all this stuff, and a child is repeating that, you have nobody to be mad at but yourself because you modeled that behavior for them. And while we are on this topic, and I'm just going to call out the physical discipline part that I talked about briefly in the beginning, from a psychological standpoint and a developmental standpoint, grabbing, physically disciplining, or spanking, pulling on a child, whatever you are doing, is not as effective as people were taught to believe. When a child is physically corrected, so, I've heard people spanking, pulling on their hair, pulling on their ear, pulling on their arm, pulling on their legs, pinching them, twisting their arm, the snake bites, I think that was called. When a child is corrected physically, their brain does not interpret that as a learning lesson or a teachable moment. It interprets it as a threat that activates the child's stress response system, shifting from fight, flight, freeze, fawn mode. And in that state, the brain is not focused on understanding behavior or learning skills, it's focused on survival. So if you grab a child by the back of their head and are yelling at them, telling them what to do or what not to do, they're going to react. And it's funny because I've seen people do that, and I've been guilty of it myself. I have not done it in a very long time, and I'm probably never going to do it again because I am more educated and informed as a parent now. However, when I see people do that to their child, I just shake my head, because think about it reversed. A child hits their sibling, hits a friend at the playground, whatever, and we go over and we spank them. Well, we can call it spanking, but it's hitting. It's the same thing. So we just told them to not hit, but then we went over and hit them to tell them not to hit. That makes no sense. And think about it for a second, roles reversed. If a child came up or somebody came up to you and hit you or grabbed you by the ponytail or grabbed you by the ear or grabbed you by the face or choked you out or pinched your arm or gave you a snake bite, or I'm giving examples of things that I've heard other people have done. All of those things would cause you to react. That's going to piss you off. That's not going to make you stop and think about anything. And if we think about it like that, think about it. If someone came up to you and told you to not do something and they smacked you around, whether it's soft and gentle or harsh and aggressive, it's the same thing. Physical correction does not teach anything. That activates the child's stress response system, shifting them into that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode. And in that state, the brain is not focused on learning anything. Over time, repeated physical discipline can teach a child to comply out of fear rather than understanding. See, it's fear that we reacted to, not the fact that we learned anything from it. This can impact their trust, emotional safety, and even their ability to regulate themselves. It can also model that when emotions are big, physical reactions are acceptable as a way to respond. That does not mean parents are bad for having been taught that, or even reacting in that way in moments of overwhelm or chaos. It just means that now in 2026, we understand more about how a child's brain develops and why we need to do things to teach that emotional regulation. And that does not mean that we are bad for having been taught that. That does not mean that we are judging anyone for having done that, because I think we've all had moments where we've lost our shit. But, discipline that teaches rather than intimidates is what actually supports long-term behavior change, emotional regulation, and builds a secure relationship between a parent and a child. And maybe that's the part that we keep getting wrong, is that society tells us to react, when in reality, we need to regulate. Maybe that's the part that feels a little uncomfortable to say out loud, because when we talk about the fear-based parenting, it's easy to label it as wrong. But I don't think wrong is the word that actually gets us anywhere. I think the better word is protective. Control can feel protective. Being the authority can feel protective. Being the one who's not questioned, being the one that your child doesn't challenge, that can feel like safety when you've lived in chaos. When you've experienced unpredictability, disrespect, or emotional instability, control starts to look like structure, and fear starts to look like respect. But they're not the same thing. That fear doesn't teach a child how to regulate, it teaches them how to avoid. It doesn't build connection, it builds compliance. And compliance might get you through in that moment, but it doesn't build the relationship that you're going to need later. The truth is, a lot of us were not taught how to parent without fear. We were taught how to survive. We were taught how to be listened to, not how to listen. We were taught how to shut things down, not how to stay present inside of them. So if you find yourself reacting from that place, this is not about shame. It's never been about shame. It's about that awareness and that healing, because that moment that you can see it is the moment that you can choose something different. Real authority is not built on fear. It's built on safety, consistency, and trust. And our kids need that more than ever in this ever-changing world. And in closing, I think the real truth is that our children don't need us to be intimidating. They need us to be intentional. And that's why I like that intentional parenting. In a world that's already loud, unpredictable, and overstimulating, fear-based parenting that society tells us is normal or that we've even normalized doesn't create strength. It's based in reality on anxiety, avoidance, and disconnection. That's the foundation of fear-based parenting, because that's what it does. In reality, they actually need a secure connection, a place where they feel safe enough to be seen, to make mistakes without feeling like they're scared, and come back to us without fear. The connection that teaches regulation, trust, and resilience. They need to have a nervous system that feels calm and settled in a world that rarely slows down. Intentional parenting is not about being perfect or permissive. It's about being present, consistent, and aware of how our responses, our behavior, and what we say shape their inner voice. Because at the end of the day, the goal is not to raise kids who listen when we're in the room. It's to raise kids who feel secure enough to navigate this crazy world when we're not there. Before I tell you guys goodbye, I just want to say this is not about blaming the generations before us. I know we've talked a little bit about the differences in parenting with generations. That's not what I want you guys to take away from this episode. A lot of them, many of them were doing the best that they could in the environments that required control just to get through the day. They parented with the tools, the knowledge, and survival strategies that they had at the time. This is about building on that, not tearing it down. We are allowed to honor where we came from while still choosing different for where we are going. Intentional parenting is the shift from fear to connection, from control to guidance, and from being obeyed to being trusted. That's the shift, and that's where the real change in our parenting comes into play. The next time that you feel inclined to react, take a pause and get down on their level. Let them see what real accountability, real support, real love feels like. Choosing that connection in the middle of chaos over and over again, even when it's inconvenient. Those small moments are what builds safety, and that safety is what lasts long after the moment has passed. Our kids need us, and our younger versions of ourselves need us to heal. I want to leave you with one final thought. The voice they hear from you today becomes the voice they will live with for the rest of their life. So parent with intent. And with that being said, I will see you later.